Hey, it's me, Rose La Fabiloca, and we are going to take down white supremacy, one pendejo at a time. This is the Ya Tu Sabe podcast. Mi gente, how is everyone? Today is Juneteenth, you guys, so happy Juneteenth to all of my African American listeners. I've had the best time this week touching on some Hispanic-oriented issues regarding race and ethnic terminology, and the ever-pressed question, are you Hispanic enough? And addressing Hispanics that don't speak Spanish. If you haven't already, please check those episodes out, and I will leave the link to them in the description box below. Please do not forget to press the subscribe button located at the bottom right underneath this video. Subscriptions help me continue to put this content out and track whether this information is even impactful or not. So make sure you press the subscribe button. Next, some announcements. Next week, we're going to be talking about Christopher Columbus and colorism as we start to transition into Black American history from there. Now, today is Friday, and of course tonight we will be celebrating with Friday Night Special, where we go through the week in review of viral content from all corners of the internet and group them into 3 categories: my favorite things, pendejos or pendejas of the week, and special shoutouts. Now, today is a very unique day because while we do have Friday Night Special tonight, today is also Juneteenth, you guys, just as I mentioned before. So this morning I will be talking about Juneteenth, its significance, why it's celebrated, some controversy around its celebration, some historical context, and why Hispanics should be celebrating Juneteenth as well, why some Black people may not celebrate Juneteenth. And originally, I was going to have a double segment on my Friday Night Special with the second topic being around Juneteenth. But then once I wrote out all of what I wanted to say, I realized it might just be better to give Juneteenth its own episode entirely and just have a bonus episode this Friday. Juneteenth is a festival held by some people in the African American community on June 19th every year to commemorate the day in June 19th, 1865, in Texas when slaves, especially in the South, were given emancipation. On this day in 1865, Union General Granger read federal orders in Galveston, Texas, that all previously enslaved Black people in Texas were finally free. So I want to provide you guys some additional context, do some historical housekeeping surrounding some misconceptions, and give a little boost to your history knowledge that you may have forgotten over the years. There are Black people, depending on region, who celebrate Emancipation Days on differing days than necessarily Juneteenth. But Emancipation Day is really just summarized, no matter what day you celebrate, Black people celebrating the independence of America and the promise of freedom from slavery. For formerly enslaved people, freedom meant an end to dealing with white masters, the cracker-ass crackers, who's selling their family members and further degrading Black people to be seen as subhuman for their own economic gain. So you guys have to understand that for formerly owned people, enslaved people at this time, freedom meant an end to all the terrorizing that the white people had done to them in regards to slave ownership and transportation, the buying and selling of their children and significant others. This promise of freedom held out the hope of self-determination, educational opportunities, and full rights to citizenship. And to give even more context, in that era of America, when it was still in its infancy in many ways, this was a challenging time for the young country because they had a hard time, they meaning like founding fathers and, that whole era. They had a hard time reconciling the idea of freedom from the British with the reality of the practice of slavery, which at that point had been a global institution and an integral part of many countries' economy, not just America. I mean, when you guys think about it, slavery had been around long before America had been doing it. Like, some people tend to forget that as well, that the idea of slaves and the idea of people ownership is not something that was just created by white people, right? Though white people have capitalized upon it in a psychological sense with white supremacy, slavery has been around for thousands of years, even prior to America and Britain and all of that. I mean, if you believe in the Bible, think back to when the Israelites were being enslaved by the Egyptians, and then they were finally freed by Moses, who was appointed by God to lead them into the promised land. Moses was an integral figure during that period of enslavement because he was adopted by the Pharaoh and raised as their own, only to find out his true identity was with the same people he had previously seen as slaves. So I mentioned that to make the point that in a time where America finally forced all of the states to stop practicing slavery, this wasn't just a huge moment for Black people, but for humanity as we know it. Slave ancestry is and was a real thing. So for thousands of years of slavery to come to an end in a country that would eventually become a world leader, this was a very big deal. So in America specifically, slavery was a huge component not only to agriculture but to the American economy as a whole. Much like how we see immigrant farm workers today being brought in from Mexico and Jamaica illegally, while slavery in the present time has been formally abolished, we still use aspects of slavery to this day in order to keep our grocery stores open and our people fed, and exports being sent out to other countries. So this idea of being knowledgeable of how we still practice elements of slavery to this day with people is really important, you guys. And it's something that I stress so much in my social circles because if you look at something that's been consistent throughout history of humanity, just period, whether you believe in biblical times or not, there is evidence that slaves were owned for thousands and thousands of years. And the idea of people ownership and outsourcing work to other people for no pay or barely any pay at the end of all of it is something that's been consistent throughout history. And when you have that kind of institution consistent throughout history, days like Juneteenth at that time marked such a huge revolution and win for humankind. And even though we have formally abolished slavery, like I said, America still has forms of slavery in mass incarceration and in farm industries and agricultural industries still to this day, except now they are not necessarily making African Americans do it, but instead having illegal immigrants like Mexican and Jamaicans doing it. So if we do not kind of have like a second wave of enlightenment, we're going to allow these kinds of institutions to keep happening. And before you know it, we will end up back in the cycle of humans being enslaved. So this is why it's important to know your history, to embrace your history, to celebrate your history, because it gives some light and reminder every year that this is something that people in power will do to you. Humans are constantly in threat of their freedom against other human beings. So there's a lot of people in America, especially conservatives, who feel like constantly bringing up slavery is something that happened in the past and that it's a race card and that it's unpatriotic and stuff. But the reality is that we need to embrace this history and embrace Juneteenth for what it is, because if we were to just forget about these kinds of things, we would just be fully depending on the education system to talk about it, and they're not going to, because if it's not made relevant in today's society, they're not going to write about it. If historians can't find a reason to bring up Juneteenth because no one's celebrating it, they're not going to keep putting it inside textbooks and just move on to something else. Because the reality is, when you're writing a textbook, you only have so much real estate space to say what you need to say. So they are filtering out what is relevant and what is not. So it's important that we give light to these kinds of holidays and celebrate them for what they are. Now, at that time, most northern states did abolish slavery and had many times different days on when these days were celebrated, depending on what region you lived in. Some African Americans celebrated it on the first of the year, while others combined the celebration with the 4th of July on American Independence Day. There are even some communities in places like Rhode Island that celebrate Juneteenth in August because that is when slavery was abolished in that particular area. So Juneteenth is especially unique in its ability to live on past just the borders of Texas, but rather a holiday celebrated nationally and internationally. There are other countries, you guys, like Canada and Nigeria, that celebrate Juneteenth as well. And these types of celebrations really speak to the fact that this event isn't just a small key point in history, but rather a large event and victory for the African American community at that time and still to this day. A lot of times when we think of national holidays like Independence Day, for example, we get so caught up in remembering the idea of it rather than the context of what life was like that got society to that place and to where we are today. So one thing I've never really understood until additional research was done in my young adulthood was why we so heavily celebrate and recognize Independence Day, but the same energy seems to not be put toward Juneteenth. But we will address that in a bit. Juneteenth and the evolution of Black people in this country really go hand in hand because being freed from the bondage of slavery birthed a transformative era for Black and American history, which segued into additional fights for civil rights and white supremacy, like the victory of winning civil rights as covered lightly in my COINTELPRO episode, and subsequently modern era victories and struggles which are prevalent talking points in our society right now today. At the time, although the Emancipation Proclamation had freed them almost 3 years earlier, and the American Civil War was mostly ended with the loss going to the Confederate States in April, Texas was the most disconnected in the slave states, and they had the least amount of Union troops to enforce the emancipation. So news was extremely slow and inconsistent, and there was no regulator there to help them. And that's a really big footnote to mention, that this time period in American history is another time period in which we see the government, the American government, throw a bone to Black people. But the reality of the bone is that it's not enforced or consistent with and covering all of Black people. It's not like they were completely unaware that they didn't have a fair amount of Union troops in Texas to enforce these things. But the economy at the time depended so heavily on slavery's position in agriculture and exporting cotton that it wasn't in the American government's interest to go cold turkey and just allow the slaves to walk off the plantations in all states. As a matter of fact, although the orders were given by General Granger, inside the orders, you guys, he gave, there wasn't anything other than the fact that they were now freed. They don't promise much of anything to the now freed slaves at all, other than their freedom. If anything, if you read the original document of General Order 3, it encourages them to fend for themselves because the federal government at that time was not prepared nor wanting to do much for them. There was no blanket guarantee of civil rights and the right to vote or equal access to jobs, better pay, and land ownership. As a matter of fact, it encouraged slaves to strike a deal with their owners in order to secure housing for their family, as the unknown was a deal you took with your freedom. So African Americans left immediately, some of them. Some stayed on the plantation because they were not really sure if it was the right decision to leave. They rightfully had their doubts because of their experiences, and they didn't entirely trust that they could just simply walk off the plantations that previously had dogs chasing after them if they tried to leave. So even some African Americans left the country entirely for new opportunities abroad with their newfound freedom and moved to places like Britain or wherever else, Some of them were no longer interested in sticking around to find out what would come of this newfound freedom. So this is what I mean by housekeeping, because a lot of people who don't know much about Juneteenth and maybe know the gist of the Emancipation Proclamation from high school, namely, non-African Americans, I'm sure, a lot of people tend to view the end of slavery as a single date where they were just freed. And I'm trying to paint to you guys that that was not the case at all. Slaves were freed slowly and gradually. It did not happen overnight. And if General Granger didn't just roll up with his 1,800 troops to Ashton Villa to be like, yo, this is what we're doing now, Texas would have kept these people enslaved. Like I told you guys, there was even at one point people that were slave owners in Louisiana bringing their slaves to Texas to hide them from the Union troops during the Civil War. So if it was up to Texas, they would still have slaves to this day. So let's just make that clear. And we are going to get into the fact that slaves were freeing themselves before a piece of paper said so. But we will get there. Just hold on. So since the end of the Civil War did not immediately come to Texas, slave owners in Texas really refused to acknowledge the war was over and wanted to still hold on to their slaves. So that's just kind of like the historical context that I'm trying to press upon you guys of what was going on in the country at the time of June 19th. And because Texas was insulated during the Civil War, it was rather easy at that time from needing to transition out of slavery. It was easy for them to avoid doing so. And like I just said that I was going to mention, there were even slave owners in Louisiana who would bring their slaves to Texas to hide them during the Civil War so they could keep them and then, go under the radar. So on June 19th, General Granger read General Orders Number 3 at the Ashton Villa in Texas, which was the former headquarters of the Army of the Confederacy. So this order informed the slaves that the war was over and that they had been freed by President Lincoln. So they had mixed reactions. Some people were shocked, some people prayed, but most sang and danced right there in the streets. And this is another thing that I want to mention of, how people tend to glorify Abraham Lincoln. Or in American history classes and education, a lot of Black people have been misled to believe that Abraham Lincoln was some president that they should all like. But the reality was that he was mediocre at best, because the reality is, although he may have signed these official documents and sent these troops over to announce this to people in Texas, it's not like he had additional legislation to make sure that Black people were taken care of after they were freed. So it's like a backhanded kind of thing. It's all politics. And this is why I say, the American government will throw bones at Black people and then expect them to be so grateful for these tiny little victories they give them. So this is why you may see people be a lot more cynical and not optimistic in current times, because why should they? Historically, why should they? Why should Black people feel that the American government has their best interests at heart and that they are going to do something about the issues that they face every day? And this is why podcasts like this exist, because if we are not bringing light to these kinds of things and making these connections with history and present day, they're going to continue to get overlooked. And until Black people are actually free and have equal rights and equal access to all opportunities, the rest of us, Hispanics, Middle Eastern, Asian, blah, 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 we are not going to be able to address our issues. So we need to follow the Black blueprint and support them, because history in this nation tells us that our little idealistic view of this country is not the case. So another thing that needs to be dispelled, that a lot of historians acknowledge to be the case but not the entire story, that a lot of people who are not, history nerds or anything like that don't really seem to understand when they're talking and having these conversations, is that it is true that Texas slaveholders had suppressed news of the Emancipation Proclamation, but the Emancipation Proclamation didn't free that many slaves, contrary to popular belief. At least not the majority of slaves. It didn't apply to the slaves in the border states that stayed loyal to the Union, And the United States couldn't dictate what the Confederate States did, or I should say the Union couldn't dictate what the Confederate States did with their slaves because they were no longer part of the United States when they were going through the Civil War. And most importantly, the slaves did not wait around for a proclamation or a piece of paper to say that they were free. Okay? That's another one of those things that a lot of conservative white people, especially Republicans, they love to have these conversations and make it seem like, Black people just sit around and wait for people to hand them things. And this is so ahistorical that it's not even funny. Again, slaves did not wait around. I want you guys to really get that in your brain. Slaves did not wait around for a proclamation or a piece of paper to say that they were free. 500,000 to 800,000 of the 3.5 million slaves in the United States at the time ran away during the Civil War. So they freed themselves. They didn't need paper or someone to let them know. So when you see celebrities like Kanye West making statements like slavery was a choice, the reason why he got so much backlash off of that was because it's insinuating and perpetuating this idea that white people believe that Black people sit around and wait for their rights to come to them. And they like to paint themselves as the heroes of everything, where white people are the ones who demand their freedom and demand their rights and have rights to bear arms, and they're very Captain Save-A-Hole, as their community, they're not afraid to take what they believe is theirs, and that Black people have just sat around and waited for these rights to come to them. And this is why it's important to stop spreading that kind of misinformation, and why so many people were mad at Kanye West for saying that, because he doesn't know his history to say something like that. Black people did not wait for the Emancipation Proclamation or Juneteenth or whatever to happen to start freeing themselves. They got tired and fucking left, okay? Look at the Underground Railroad. So it's just, for people to be making statements like that of ignorance is just, all it's doing is perpetuating this notion that Black people are helpless, and it's just very damaging to progress. Another portion to give context to what the mentality was at the time for Black people is that many Black people had come to know that the war was supposed to be about freedom and emancipation, so many ran to Union lines and set up camps and started free communities, communities of free Black people. And those who didn't run, though, were already shifting the power dynamics on the plantation and the farms throughout the South, including Texas. One family, which was brought up by a historian that was speaking about Juneteenth, was this slave who shifted the power dynamics by telling his slave owners that his wife would no longer be working on the plantation. She would be staying in the home inside where they lived, and she would not be working the fields any longer. So even that shifted the power dynamics of saying, no, my children and my wife are not going to be out here in these fields. As a man, I'll do the work, and that's just going to be that. That's the work you're getting from us, and that's it. So that's a huge shift at that time. And because of all of this freeing going on at the time, these slave owners kind of were backed into a corner because they knew that there was a possibility that any day that slave who was making them money could just walk off and leave. And there's not much legally they could do about it. I mean, they also probably didn't give a fuck and would shoot them anyway, but it's just, at this point, Black people had already created this kind of community of freedom. So there was a power shift there. So Africans were already forging new vision of freedom and citizenship long before Juneteenth. And this is not to say that Juneteenth is not important, because it is. Juneteenth is important because with that announcement, it was only then that Texans were forced to acknowledge that African Americans were freed and not property. And many of those African Americans wanted to get away from their masters and find their family. So some came back and some never returned. Now, some more historical context for what was going on at that time was that the Black church was one of the most important independent institutions that helped bring forth the celebrations of Juneteenth in the African American community. And it was really central to these celebrations. The celebrations had parties with food, sporting events, horse races, baseball games. They sang spirituals like Go Down Moses. And in the 1860s at IPN Colony, which was a freedom colony in Blanco County, the Baptist Church held special Juneteenth services where the children marched in a circle from the church to the school to the cemetery and back to the church in a symbolic reuniting of free people, free living people with the deceased and unfree ancestors. So this was a walk in freedom. And when you think about it, that's just so beautiful when you think about it. Like, it's just, it gives me goosebumps because it's like, these are people, like I talked about last episode, in regards to Hispanics being enslaved as well, where we all have this ancestry of our people being mistreated and enslaved. And this was a very big deal for Black people at that time to finally be able to have this freedom that was finally given to them and acknowledge that there's so many of their ancestors who never saw that day come and who sacrificed and just kept holding on with their strength and as a community in order to get to that point. So it's a very emotional and just something that is it really speaks to something for me as a Hispanic when I am studying these kinds of topics, because we have so much overlap, and I feel a lot of the same way where in our community we also have our extinct Taino Indians who, at that time that they were going through all of that stuff, had no idea that we would be where we are today. So this is why it's important to celebrate events like Juneteenth as Black people, as Hispanics, because we can't forget that this is our history. This is a part of our identity. It's part of our struggle. And so if we just forget these things, then we forget people who every day were hoping that humanity could get to this place where we are today for them, who probably dreamed huge dreams for themselves that they never saw come to fruition. And here we are, allowed to dream dreams, even if we have to work twice as hard as white people. Just the fact that we have the opportunity to be free it says something. So by 1870 in Texas, there were nearly 50 freedom colonies and settlements of the emancipated African Americans. And as early as 1891, African Americans in their communities were calling Jubilee Day Juneteenth. So by early 1900s, Juneteenth celebrations had spread from Texas to other southern states, and even in a lot of cases rivaled Independence Day celebrations. So from the outside, it might seem like these people were just having these great big parties with singing and dancing and fun games. But even as early as this time, Black people were also sitting around talking about their rights and having those types of dialogues within these get-togethers of Juneteenth to discuss political participation. They had even had some politicians that would come stomp around all of these celebrations to get the African American vote. So these politicians encouraged the Black people to register to vote because freedom included the right to vote, and the right was slowly being taken away during the last decades of the 1800s and was compromised by the early 1900s. So in the 1930s, large-scale community Juneteenth celebrations started to become less frequent. Although many still celebrated in their homes and at their churches and in small communities, the large celebrations and stuff became less frequent. And if you look at the 1920s time period in America, especially around World War I, segregation was firmly in place. There were issues with nativism that tied into that, which basically, nativism meaning rejection of outsiders and a fear of foreigners. Combining segregation, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and nativism led many white people and even some Black people to see Juneteenth as un-American because it focused on this dark period of American history of slavery at the same time that the United States was trying to show itself as a global power and a democratic establishment on the world stage. So it was like this flex that they were trying to do, and celebrating Juneteenth seemed like it kind of made it not the case anymore, made them look like they were trivializing their entire intention of, their whole flex. So Juneteenth was considered unpatriotic, and by celebrating it, it somehow meant at that time that you were disloyal to the United States. So there was also some dark days at that time, because this was during the Red Summer, which was a wave of deadly lynchings and race riots that occurred in the United States between 1919 and 1921. And despite these types of eras, Juneteenth has lived on, because built within its meaning is a spirit of freedom. So there was a renaissance that came surrounding Juneteenth shortly before the United States went to World War II. And the catalyst of that was in Dallas, Texas, when Antonio Maceo Smith led efforts to create an exhibit of African American life and culture. And organizers refused, and so he went over their heads to the federal government and received money to build the Hall of Negro Life. And then in 1979, Democratic Representative Al Edwards pushes House Bill 1016 in an effort to make Juneteenth a state holiday. So there's this coalition of African American and Hispanic legislators who worked together to support the bill, and it subsequently succeeded and became the first state's emancipation holiday on June 7th of 1979, about a week before Juneteenth of that year. So Juneteenth is important because we need to consider Juneteenth as a look inside American history instead of something that happens parallel to U.S. history, which people tend to do so much with people do this so much with Black history, where they look at it as parallel to American history, when the reality is that all of these things are American history, because Black people are American, and in order for America to get off of the ground, it was on the backs of Black people. So we have to stop seeing Black history as something that is parallel, like I said, to American history, and rather something inside of it. Because when we do that, we get into the deeper meaning of all of these events like Juneteenth that some have believed to be some secret or hidden mystery or something that nobody knows about and all that kind of stuff. And granted, a lot of people don't know about it, but it's because of the fact that we are seeing Black history in our education system as something parallel to American history rather than a part of it. So I hope you guys enjoyed this Juneteenth episode, and I hope that you guys learned something new. And again, as a Hispanic American, being bicultural and balancing that Hispanic heritage and history with American heritage and history, it's important that we are joining in on this holiday and celebrating in it and being involved, because celebrating the end of slavery not only was a mark to the release of the shackles of bondage for African Americans, but it also reverberated that symbol of freedom for both our shared slave ancestors who never got to see the day where our communities walked free. So thank you so much for watching this episode, and join me tonight for a Friday night special. See you then. Bye.
The band that Moses led. Gods are gonna trouble the water. Wade in the water. Wade in the water. Children, wade in the water. God is gonna trouble, yes he will. The water. Trouble. God's gonna trouble the water. There's healing in the water, yeah. The water. Deliverance in the water. God's gonna trouble the water. My God is gonna trouble the water.